The courthouse stood beneath an overcast sky, its gray columns towering like sentinels over years of whispered secrets and buried truths, the kind no one dared bring into the light, until now. Pam Bondi entered the building with a sharp breath and steady stride, her heels echoing off the marble as if each step carried a verdict of its own. The moment her figure appeared through the polished glass doors, the bustling crowd of attorneys and journalists seemed to freeze, recognizing the gravity of what was about to unfold. In her eyes burned a fire not of anger, but of unshakable resolve, the kind born only when silence has gone on too long and justice too long denied. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense, thick with a kind of anticipation that made every shuffle of paper and creak of wood seem amplified. Spectators, attorneys, and even seasoned judges could not help but glance at each other in uneasy silence. The courtroom had seen its fair share of theatrics, of half-truths and bent rules, but what was coming now felt different. Pam moved past the rows of uncertain faces, toward the center, where justice should have lived all along. Her voice didn't rise immediately. It didn't need to. The calm in her tone cut deeper than any shout, because it spoke with the weight of someone who had finally had enough of pretending not to see. "I will not pretend anymore," she said, her words measured and deliberate. "I will not stand in a courtroom and accept the illusion that what happens here is fair." Her eyes didn't flinch as they met those of the presiding judge, whose robe looked suddenly heavier on his shoulders. Gasps rose like a wave from the gallery, soft but unmistakable. She wasn't speaking in abstract accusations. She was looking straight into the soul of the system, daring it to deny what it already knew. Somewhere in the back, a young clerk's pen paused in midair, his hand trembling slightly, as if the truth alone was enough to make the ink dry up. Pam's fingers tightened around the stack of documents in her hand. Papers not just filled with motions or transcripts, but with evidence of collusion, of procedural abuse, of decisions made in private chambers that altered lives without a whisper of transparency. She laid them on the table before her like weapons, not of destruction, but of revelation. "These are names," she said. "These are dates. These are sealed orders and closed-door deals. These are victims, real people, not footnotes in a file." Her voice cracked just slightly on that last line, and it only made her stronger, more human, more impossible to ignore. Across the room, a senior prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw clenching as if bracing for a storm he could no longer outmaneuver. For years, whispers had followed his career, dismissed cases, evidence that disappeared, witnesses that were never called, but never had anyone dared to say it aloud, until now. Pam turned to him slowly, not with vengeance in her eyes, but with a quiet demand for accountability that shook harder than any accusation. "You know what you've done," she said, "and so does this room." A pause followed that felt like it swallowed time itself. Even the judge's gavel sat untouched, as if the wooden handle feared the touch of a trembling hand. Pam continued, her words now like cold wind through a house that had long stood shut. She spoke of a system that punished the poor and protected, the powerful of plea deals offered like threats, of evidence withheld like bargaining chips. She didn't look away. She didn't stutter. And as she did, she could feel the weight of decades pushing against her, a mountain of silence she was determined to break, brick by buried brick. Behind her, someone wept softly, an older woman, whose son had spent 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The only evidence a forced confession made after 36 sleepless hours in a precinct room with no lawyer. Pam didn't have to say his name. The mother knew, and that was enough. The emotion in the room shifted, no longer just tension, but something else. Something dangerous to the corrupt and holy to the innocent. Hope. Pam's hands didn't shake as she picked up the next document, though her voice carried the tremor of righteous fury barely restrained. She held it aloft not for the court, but for the people watching, the ones who had been told to sit down, shut up, and accept their place beneath a bench that had never been balanced. "This," she said, her voice rising just enough to touch every corner of the room, "is a sworn affidavit from a whistleblower inside your own chambers. This is testimony, not rumor, not hearsay, truth. corroborated, time-stamped, and sealed under fear of retaliation. The weight of it fell heavier than a verdict. The silence that followed was not just stunned, it was sacred. The judge's face was unreadable now, but his eyes flickered once to the bailiff, and in that glance lived fear. Real fear. Not of Pam, but of the exposure creeping toward him like morning light under a locked door. He adjusted his collar, the black fabric now clinging to his skin like regret. Pam watched him, unblinking. "How many rulings have you handed down with a smirk?" she asked, knowing full well the evidence had been manipulated before it ever reached your desk. A single cough broke the silence, an involuntary sound from the back of the room that somehow felt like a scream in the quiet. She turned then to the gallery, to the faces, some wide-eyed, some weeping, some hardened by too many losses in this very room. "You thought no one would speak." That justice was too afraid of its own shadow. That power, once given, could never be challenged. Her voice dropped, not from weakness, but with the gravity of a truth too powerful to shout. "But you were wrong." From her folder came photograph. After photograph, stapled reports, notations and margins that didn't match the official record. Case files altered after verdicts were decided. Bail set based on race, on silence, on who had the better connections, not who had the truth. Pam's voice did not waver, even as her eyes began to shine. "You let a 16-year-old boy rot in solitary for 18 months because you didn't want to look weak on crime," she said, holding up his mugshot where his bruised face and bloodied lips still looked too young to understand betrayal. "You called it a necessary delay. I call it a stolen life." A low murmur began to rise, first from one man in the gallery, then another, until the room was no longer quiet, but humming, with grief, with rage, with awakening. Pam didn't stop. She moved like a conductor now, not of music, but of reckoning. She pointed to a former defense attorney, now a politician in the front row, whose expression had gone pale and tight. "You lobbied for harsher minimums while representing clients you knew would suffer under them. You said it was the law. No, you made it the law." Her voice rose again, not to yell, but to lift the room into a fevered clarity it had never felt before. "These hallways have echoed with the footsteps of the forgotten, the wrongly accused, the silenced, and we are here to remind you, they never walked alone." A beat of silence fell, but it wasn't empty. It was the stillness before a storm that could not be unmade. She took a step forward toward the judge's bench, placing a final folder down, thick and bursting with damning proof. "I request, not for myself but for every name in these files, a full federal investigation into the practices of this court and the individuals sworn to uphold it." Her words dropped like iron. "This is not a request for reform. This is a demand for reckoning." And then she stood still, her arms at her sides, chest rising with the breath of someone who had said the one thing they'd waited a lifetime to say. The courtroom was so quiet that when the ceiling fan clicked, everyone heard it. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the bailiff, trained to intervene at the slightest disruption, stayed frozen, his eyes locked on hers not with authority, but awe. In that silence, something ancient and sacred stirred. The sound of the walls remembering their duty, the feeling of justice, long dormant, turning its face back toward the light. And Pam Bondi, standing alone but never lonely, watched it all with steady eyes, knowing full well that the war had only just begun. The stillness held like breath underwater, every soul in the room suspended between denial and the inevitability of truth. And then slowly, as if the weight of it had finally settled on his spine, the judge leaned forward, his hands folded but unsteady, the tremor betraying what his practiced face still tried to conceal. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but found that words had deserted him. There was nothing left to say in the face of evidence that screamed louder than excuses ever could. Pam watched him, not with triumph, but with the steel empathy of someone who knows that even the guilty carry their own kind of scars. The courtroom had become a theater of reckoning, not with performances, but with unmasking. Every eye had turned, Inward now, not just to those on trial, but to themselves. Jurors who had once trusted every instruction now questioned every word they'd ever heard in this room. Lawyers remembered the cases they lost without understanding why, the motions that vanished, the rulings that made no legal sense until now. A public defender sat back, eyes glazed, whispering a client's name under his breath like a prayer, as if speaking it might summon him back from the system that swallowed him. Pam's hand remained on the folder she had just placed, the final dossier, but her gaze swept the room like a flame looking for dry wood. She saw it in every corner. Shame, fear, defiance, and awakening. A young woman in the press row stared at her laptop, fingers still hovering over keys, too stunned to type. A retired detective, once praised for his conviction rates, looked at the ceiling with glassy eyes, as if trying to remember how many shortcuts he had taken, how many quiet warnings he had ignored. "You have built an empire on doubt," Pammy said then, her voice slower, deeper now, as though she were burying each sentence like a nail into a coffin. "You preyed on the uncertainty of the poor, the voiceless, the exhausted. You counted on their silence, their confusion, their desperation." She moved toward the prosecution's table, her steps deliberate, each one echoing like a drumbeat in the dead air. "But what you didn't count on was me." A man in a gray suit, middle-aged and well-groomed, stood up suddenly. The assistant district attorney. His face was flush, not with indignation, but panic. "Ms. Bondi, this is highly irregular," he stammered, his voice cracked and clumsy against the silence she had shaped like a weapon. She turned to him slowly, as if giving him a moment to feel the full weight of what he had just interrupted. "So was falsifying toxicology reports to secure convictions for your donors," she replied. "Shall I list the names? Or would you prefer I submit the voice recordings first?" He sat down. There was no gavel to break the moment, no booming. Command to restore order, because the only thing restored in that courtroom was the truth. Pam took a long, steady breath, and then finally turned her attention to the gallery once more. She saw mothers holding photos, men with scarred hands and sunken eyes, sitting as witnesses to their own forgotten lives. Law students, once hopeful, now awake, and beyond them all, the presence of the invisible, the ghosts of justice denied, crowding the edges of the room like wind before a storm. "You told the people that the system was broken," she said, her tone heavy with sorrow and fire. "But it isn't broken. It was built this way. And today we start tearing it down." The words didn't echo. They settled, like ash, like truth. And in that silence, the judge's gavel finally moved, not with force, but with the resignation of a man who understood that nothing would ever be the same again. It struck the wood once, a hollow sound, and then rested again, unused, as if the court itself was too ashamed to wear its own authority. Pam stepped back, not retreating, but reclaiming space, hers and everyone's who had ever sat in that courtroom and dared to believe justice was possible. Outside, the wind had picked up. Reporters were already gathering. Cameras were waiting. But for a long moment, no one inside the room moved. They sat with it, all of it, the lies and the names and the truth too long held hostage. Pam didn't look back. She didn't have to. The walls would remember. The heavy wooden doors creaked open as Pam stepped into the hallway, and the light that struck her face was not sunlight, but the fierce glare of flashbulbs, the instant white-hot blink of exposure that no lie could hide from. A flood of reporters surged forward, their voices clashing in chaotic waves, desperate to capture the woman who had just pierced the heart of the justice system with nothing but truth and steel. Microphones thrust toward her like weapons and shields. Cameras clicked like a chorus of broken clocks, and yet Pam moved through them as if they were ghosts. She did not stop. Not yet. Not while the battle still breathed behind her. Behind the crowd, huddled near the pillars, stood victims, some too scared to speak, others already sobbing in the open, letting the dam of years collapse all at once. A teenage boy clutched his father's hand, the same father who had just 2 weeks before been exonerated after a 15-year wrongful conviction. The boy's eyes followed Pam as if watching a myth made flesh. She noticed. She always noticed. She paused then, just for him, and gave a nod that said everything. I see you. I believe you. This fight is yours now, too. Inside, the courtroom was not yet empty. Some stayed seated, as if rising would break the fragile miracle they'd just witnessed. The judge remained slouched, his hands shaking faintly as he removed his glasses and looked at the grain of his bench like it might offer some escape. But there was none. His clerk leaned in to whisper something, but he waved her away. No words could smooth over what had been spoken aloud after decades of silence. Every corner of the room now echoed with a new sound, the absence of fear. Back in the hallway, Pam finally stopped. Her team had caught up to her, assistants, legal advisors, people with clipboards and worry in their eyes. But she raised one hand, and they stilled. She turned slowly, deliberately to face the sea of press, the wall of lenses that separated her from the people who had never been let inside the story until today. Her expression was not one of victory, but of burden, the kind carried by those who choose to walk directly into the fire while everyone else runs from the smoke. You want a statement? She asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to silence the crowd. No microphone needed. The words carried on something deeper than air, conviction. Here's your statement. Today was not about me. It was about truth. It was about the weight of silence that has crushed families and erased lives. And it was about making damn sure that silence ends here. The flashbulbs paused. Even the air seemed to still around her. For too long you've asked the wrong questions, she continued, taking a step forward. You ask how many were guilty. I ask how many were lost. You ask about law and order. I ask, whose law? Whose order? Who gets to walk free because they wore a suit instead of handcuffs, because their lies were told in courtrooms instead of alleyways? There was no shouting now, no interruptions, just faces, some skeptical, some moved, all watching something rare unfold. A reckoning. A reckoning not in theory, but in form. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed at the corners, trembling slightly as she held it. This, she said, was written by a man who died in prison for a crime he didn't commit. A man whose lawyer was never allowed to present exonerating evidence because a judge sealed it. That judge was sitting on the bench today. She unfolded the letter with a kind of reverence, her hands almost maternal in their care. He wrote this before he died, and I want you to hear his words. She read aloud, and the hallway fell into a stunned, aching silence. If you ever find this, know that I forgive them. But I don't forgive the silence. I don't forgive the ones who knew and stayed quiet. If justice ever wakes up, tell her I waited. Pam lowered the page slowly. Her voice cracked as she finished. But she let it. She did not hide her tears. They were not weakness. They were ceremony, a funeral for the silence and a baptism for the truth. Around her, the mood shifted. Not frenzy, not scandal, reverence. Journalists lowered their cameras. People wept quietly behind clipboards and notepads. Even the harshest critics in the crowd found no armor strong enough to deflect what they had just witnessed. His name was Elijah Moore, she said, folding the letter again. And he's not just a statistic. He's the reason I stood in that courtroom today. He's the reason I won't stop. The crowd parted as she walked forward, not out of fear, but something closer to awe. She moved like a verdict, like a truth long delayed but no longer denied. Somewhere in the crowd, a former defendant dropped to his knees, sobbing into his hands, not because he was broken, but because something inside him had finally begun to mend. Behind her, the courthouse doors stayed open, and for the first time, in years, justice walked out with her. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, solemn shadows across the courthouse steps, as if the building itself was bowing under the weight of what had happened within its walls. Pam descended slowly, her pace unhurried, not because she was tired, but because she knew every step meant something now, meant everything. Each footfall echoed down the steps like a drumbeat, steady and sure, reverberating not just through stone, but through history. The people followed, Not with cheers, not with chants, but with quiet, purposeful footsteps, as though joining a pilgrimage born from pain, not spectacle. At the bottom of the stairs, a crowd had formed, not just reporters, but survivors. Wrongfully imprisoned men and women, family members of the lost, advocates, whistleblowers, those who had never before dared to gather in daylight and speak truth aloud. They watched her approach as one might watch a lighthouse through stormed glass, something steady when everything else has drowned. Pam paused as she reached them, her eyes scanning each face. She saw wounds there. Not the kind that bleed, but the kind that burn forever beneath the skin. And they saw in her not a savior, but a signal that their pain was no longer invisible. One woman stepped forward, clutching a framed photo to her chest. Her hands shook and her voice was thin with disbelief as she whispered, "You said his name." It was Elijah's mother. Pam's eyes brimmed again, and this time she didn't speak. She simply opened her arms and held the woman, held her with the kind of strength that says, "I am here, and I am not leaving." The crowd didn't erupt. It hushed. A single moment held sacred, proof that sometimes justice begins with a name and a hug under a bruised sky. As the embrace broke, a man stepped out next, then another. Then a young woman who had testified in secret years ago and never been heard again. One by one, they stood beside Pam, not behind her, creating a line across the courthouse steps. A living indictment. A choir of the wounded finally given a stage. They didn't have to speak. Their presence was the testimony. Pam turned slowly to face the cameras that still lingered on the periphery, the world watching through screens, unsure whether to be inspired or terrified. "You want headlines?" she said, louder now, not angry, but unrelenting. "Write this down. We are not going away. This system will answer for every name it erased, every voice it silenced, every ruling bought behind mahogany doors. We are not asking for change anymore. We are demanding it, and we are not alone." A man in a suit, tall and grim-faced, stepped forward from the side. A federal investigator, not one of the local agencies that had long grown mossy with complicity, but someone from outside, someone with a mandate and a badge that still meant something. He met Pam's gaze and nodded once. It was enough. The papers she had handed over were already in motion, triggering inquiries, grand juries, protective subpoenas. What began in one courtroom was now poised to crawl like fire through every hidden chamber in the judicial system, unraveling what too many had labeled unshakable. Pam's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Messages poured in, judges resigning. Quietly, attorneys flipping, politicians issuing dry, stammered statements under the guise of concern. But she didn't look at any of them. Her eyes were on the people, the real courtroom, the real jury, and as the first star pierced the dimming sky, she felt it, something shift in the air like a wound beginning to breathe. "We'll be back here," she said, "and the next courtroom, and the next." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through, the growing dusk like lightning through mist. "And you will see us coming." Behind her, one of the wrongfully convicted stepped forward and raised a hand. Not in anger, not in rage, in solemn salute. Others followed. The crowd did not cheer. They stood, in reverence, in solidarity, in the unspoken truth that they were no longer shadows. And as Pam turned to leave, her shadow stretched long behind her, not as something dark, but as a bridge. A bridge the rest would now begin to cross. The night had fully arrived by the time Pam reached her car, the sky above her a deep, endless black flecked with stars that seemed somehow brighter than they had been the night before. But it wasn't just the stars, it was the world itself, tilted slightly, as though something immense and invisible had shifted. She stood there for a moment, hand on the door handle, staring at the courthouse behind her, its grand columns now, bathed in soft, golden light from the street lamps. A temple, no longer of blind justice, but of memory, of reckoning. She didn't get in. Not yet. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the faces of those still gathered. Those who didn't want to go home, those who couldn't. Some stood in silence. Others hugged like survivors of a war they'd only now realized was finally, maybe, coming to an end. A little girl sat on the steps holding a candle, the flame trembling in the breeze but never going out. Pam walked to her, knelt beside her, and asked gently, "What's your name?" The girl looked up with wide eyes and said softly, "I'm Justice." And Pam smiled through a sudden wave of tears, not from pain, but from the strange and sacred truth of that moment. She placed a hand over the girl's heart. "Then never let them forget you," she said. Word had already spread far beyond the courthouse, through headlines, on live streams, across every platform with a signal. Her name was everywhere. The footage of her speech, her confrontation, the letter, it had gone viral. But it wasn't celebrity that followed her now. It was legacy. Not the kind written on plaques, but the kind carved into people. The kind that wakes them up. Across the country, phones rang in prosecutors' offices and law schools, in police departments and courtrooms. Conversations were no longer hypothetical. They were terrified. What if others stood up? What if someone else pulled the curtain back? What if silence wasn't enough anymore? But in the quiet corners of living rooms and kitchens, something else was happening too. People who had felt forgotten were sitting up straighter. People who had given up were rethinking what they believed was possible. Families with scars too deep to speak of were holding one another closer. And somewhere, in a small town with no spotlight, a woman picked up her old case file and whispered, "Maybe I'll try again." Pam finally climbed into the car, and for a long moment she didn't start the engine. She let herself feel the ache, the exhaustion, the grief, the overwhelming swell of purpose. This wasn't over. It would get uglier. There would be retaliation, backlash, headlines twisted against her, threats that slithered in under locked doors. She would lose friends. She might lose more. But she had made her choice long ago, and she would not flinch now. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes, and began typing, her fingers steady. Not a press release, not a speech, just names, one after another. Every name she had ever seen, buried in a file, every story half told, every truth smothered by procedure. She wouldn't let them fade, not one. The list grew longer with every breath, and she wrote them like prayers. Outside the window, the candle in the little girl's hand still flickered. Pam whispered to the dark, "Let them come. Let them try." And then she drove, the taillights, bleeding red down the street like the trail of something holy and burning. Behind her, the courthouse remained lit, not by power, but by presence. Because justice wasn't a statue anymore. It had a voice, it had a heartbeat, and it had a name. Pam Bondi.